How does equine flu spread between horses?
So flu is mostly spread through air. So when horses cough, there's basically sending out clouds of virus to each other, and that's why it spreads so easily. We hear and talk about it being 25 meters, but in the right conditions, it can really spread further, and they've even reported up to 5 kilometers. It can, though, also spread by what we call fomites, so contact and direct. So your hands, your clothes, tacking equipment. So really simple things will make a big difference with washing your hands. Don't go straight from a sick horse to a healthy one, not sharing buckets, water troughs, etc. And then using disinfectants where you can. But then I think this really brings out one of the most important things about having horses, especially on big yards, is that good biosecurity shouldn't just be for outbreaks. It should be an everyday habit, and having these things and always keeping horses things separate, keeping separate units for different types of horses moving around will really help close an outbreak as and when it arrives into your yard.
What are the signs that your horse has equine influenza?
So I think one of the first really important things to think about is how flu progresses and the profile of it as the horse is exposed to it. So there's what we call an incubation period, which basically means the horse has been exposed, the virus is building up in the body, but they don't yet look obviously sick. So with flu, that happens quite quickly within a couple of days. And actually horses can be spreading the virus before you even realize there's a problem. Usually what we see is a peak around 2 to 3 days, and then most horses will stop shedding virus by about 7 to 10 days. But to be safe, we always say don't mix them back until about 2 weeks after everything's resolved. So in terms of what this looks like, early on, it can be really subtle. They might just be a bit quiet, not eating up properly, just not quite themselves. And then the more obvious signs come in. So a quite harsh cough, which is dry, a runny nose, which can get thicker, and a temperature. So normal temperature should be under 38.5 degrees. So having a thermometer on the yard is honestly one of the most useful things and often the first sign. And it's worth saying as well that unvaccinated horses can tend to get this much worse. And we can see secondary infections up to pneumonia. And it's not something to take lightly. The cough can then persist, and it can really then be quite performance limiting.
What should we do if we suspect our horses have flu?
So if you are worried your horse might have flu, the absolute first thing is to isolate them. And I mean, properly isolate, keep them well away from other horses, no nose-to-nose contact, shared airspace, and a field apart, ideally, if you can, and have that possibility to throw them out. There's no crossing over of people, of staff, hacking out, buckets, all that sort of thing. Because by the time you are noticing signs, they've probably already been infectious for a little while. And then call your vet. So then they'll come in, assess them. Respiratory diseases can all look quite similar in the beginning, such as strangles and herpes, but they can have very different implications. So the vet can then take samples where needed, and those results are usually pretty quick. And they are the same day or next day, and they can then generally just be treated medically on the yard with some anti-inflammatories and TLC.
If an outbreak is confirmed, what process should you follow?
So I think the point here is the isolation and the stopping or moving of horses on and off the yard until you really understand what the risk assessment is. So thinking about the in-contacts of the horses that you know about, separating them into groups, so infected, exposed and healthy. So ones that are already starting to cough or have a bit of a temperature that you can say, right, that is that one group. Then there's the exposed group that you know may have been in contact but showing no clinical signs, and then healthy ones that are completely separate. So excuse me, keeping those separate will really reduce the shedding and the spread of this disease. Taking their temperatures, as I've said, is the first one here, and it will show you what is happening and if there's anything starting to come. We often get asked about vaccinating in the face of an outbreak, and especially if any horses have not been vaccinated within the last 6 months or of an unknown vaccination status. For any at risk but no clinical signs horses, this will really reduce the risk of it spreading and clinical disease, obviously, in those cases.
What is the best way to protect our horses from the risk of flu?
So I think the best way to think about this is in two parts. So there is the protecting the horse from being exposed in the first place, so isolating and restricting movements and that sort of thing, and then vaccinating. This provides the horse its own immune response should it ever be exposed to it. So I think of the outbreaks that we've had reported to EIDS in the last month, the majority have been horses that have recently moved premises or been imported into the country, and then the rest of them have been unvaccinated horses. So, sorry, not unvaccinated. There were 4 of them were vaccinated. So we'll discuss that, I'm sure, again shortly, but most of these horses are unvaccinated or have an unknown vaccination status. So they're the ones that we are seeing with clinical disease, is the ones that are unvaccinated.
So can vaccinated horses still catch or spread flu?
Yes, absolutely, is the honest answer. So vaccination reduces the risk of clinical disease and severity of signs of clinical disease, and it reduces the amount that they shed, but they still receive the virus, they still replicate the virus, and they can definitely still pass it on. It's just a lot less of a concern for that individual horse. If they can reduce shedding, it then reduces the likelihood that they're going to spread it onto other horses in the yard, and it really does protect the national herd, in so much that if they are not passing it on, then other horses who are not protected by vaccination are much safer if they are naive.
Is it true that 6 monthly booster vaccines provide a more effective protection?
I think that this one is quite a tricky question, because I know that for years annual vaccination is what we've all been recommended. However, more recent studies and in-field experience is really starting to show that actually horses are more likely to show clinical disease even if they have been vaccinated, if it is after 6 months. So the studies initially showing that antibodies tend to wane after the 6 months is definitely true, but we are seeing that in real life practice as well. So horses that are in big yards that have an exposure, horses that are 8, 9, 10 months are actually showing some signs of clinical disease, whereas actually the ones that are in the 3 or 4 months are in that higher peak of antibodies protection, and therefore less likely to show any clinical signs and shedding.
If your horse doesn't travel or compete, should you still continue to vaccinate them against flu?
This is an understandable question, and I think this is really about risk assessment for your own horse. And if you are in a yard where every other horse is going out and competing, you can't be sure that they're not bringing it back with them. Even if they are vaccinated, as I've said before, these horses are still able to carry virus and bring it back to your horse. If your horse is completely naive, we know they show more severe clinical signs, and that's the bit you're trying to protect. Also, if you have your horse and you say it's on its own, but you have horses 2 or 3 fields away, you can't be sure that they also don't have it. And in the right warm winds that we're having at the moment, that can definitely travel over and expose your horse. So I think it is obviously within your own risk, but it is a possibility that your horse will be exposed without you trying, and you don't know what other horses are moving around and coming past you all the time.
If your horse has had a bad reaction to vaccination in the past, should you continue to vaccinate? And if so, is there anything you can do to lessen the reaction?
Yes, absolutely. Most vaccination reactions are pretty mild. You might get a sore neck. So generally vaccines are put into the neck muscles, and they can get a bit of soreness there. Don't want to put their head down. It can look like they're not eating, but actually if you palpate the neck, it just feels a little bit sore and hot. So they may be a bit quiet for a day or 2 after that. And those sorts of vaccine reactions don't tend to happen every time, although some horses will. In those cases, you could ask your vet to either put it in a different location, either in the chest, is in the pectoral muscles. Another option is to use a different type of vaccine. There's a couple of brands, but generally it's more that individual injection as opposed to the actual immunization itself that has caused the soreness and the muscle soreness in that reaction. Obviously, if they are sore, you could ask your vet the next day to give some anti-inflammatories and that sort of thing, but we wouldn't tend to give it at the same time. Even if we knew that horse every time had a reaction, we wouldn't say here's some anti-inflammatories at the same time. We just wait to see what happened, because generally we do consider this to be a one-off occasion, even though you do tend to see it. there is obviously the other type of vaccine, genuine reaction of anaphylaxis. And in that case, once they've got over that initial complication, you might definitely think about swapping to a different strain of vaccine if you thought that that was the immunization itself that they had reacted to. So I think vaccinating really does still outweigh these mild reactions that you tend to get. And I know some of them can seem quite sore in that moment, but they do tend to get over them pretty quickly. It usually only lasts a couple of days with a bit of TLC and cold packing and anti-inflammatories.
How soon should you compete your horse after they've been vaccinated?
So I think this depends on your level of competition, really. And there are governing body ones. As a general rule, the FEI and Pony Club is not within 7 days of vaccination to entering the premises. BHA has its own rules, so as well, which is a week from, so you could vaccinate on Saturday, race the next Saturday. But aside from the rules, it's really how you know your horse again reacts to it. Horses can feel a bit off or a bit quiet after a vaccine, so it's sensible not to plan a big lesson the next day, especially if you know that they do tend to get sore, to look after them in those few days afterwards. But generally that is more reliant on your governing body and how you compete to check before you go.
What steps should be taken with new arrivals on the yard to reduce the risk of a disease outbreak?
This then comes back to that incubation period and knowing that in that first wave of any virus that you could see a horse that's producing virus but actually not yet showing any clinical signs. So it's really important to get them isolated first when horses arrive, so that they are in a 2-week window where they can produce virus, possibly get sick, be in their own space and recover. And then they are able to move into the yard knowing that after 2 weeks they're not shedding. And then I think the other really important part on this is checking the vaccination status of all horses that arrive with the passport before they unload, because you can be told, oh, well, I think he maybe had it recently, but you don't know. And at least you know when you're isolating that horse that they are then it's even slightly higher risk, and how to mitigate that and keeping them definitely separate from the rest of your group. You can test them, so you can have horses arrive with a nasopharyngeal swab result, but that negative test is really only that moment in time. And then again, if we think about the peak of them shedding, it could either be in the peak before, once they've started shedding, once they've started replicating virus but not actually showing any overt clinical signs, or it can be in the bit after where it's just dropped below the testable levels but still technically shedding. So they're the ones that a negative test doesn't necessarily mean that you are absolutely safe to mix the horse with yours.